There exists a moment in every person's life when they realize that kindness has been mistaken for weakness, that patience has been perceived as permission, and that silence has been interpreted as surrender. In that precise instant, something shifts within the soul, a recognition that the world does not reward the meek with dignity, but rather tests them with contempt until they demonstrate otherwise. Niccolo Machiavelli understood this truth with crystalline clarity centuries ago, observing the courts of Florence and the battlefields of Italy, witnessing how power flows not to those who deserve it most, but to those who command it with unwavering conviction. He saw that respect is not freely given as a courtesy between equals, but is extracted through the calculated demonstration of one's capacity to impose consequences, to set boundaries that cannot be crossed without cost, and to project an image of formidable presence that makes others think twice before transgressing. The painful reality that most people discover too late is that the very behaviors they were taught would earn them love and appreciation often invite the opposite, drawing to them individuals who see gentleness as an opportunity rather than a virtue, who interpret accommodation as exploitability rather than generosity. Machiavelli observed this pattern repeating endlessly throughout history, watching as principalities fell, not because their rulers lacked virtue, but because they lacked the willingness to be feared when necessary, to understand that the political arena, like all human interactions, operates on principles of power dynamics rather than fairness or justice. He recognized that those who refuse to acknowledge these dynamics do not transcend them, but merely become their victims, subject to manipulation by those less scrupulous, less idealistic, and more attuned to the mechanics of influence and control. What transforms this observation from mere cynicism into practical wisdom is the recognition that power, properly understood, is not about domination for its own sake, but about autonomy, about creating the conditions under which you can pursue your purposes without constant interference, sabotage, or disrespect from others who would otherwise test your limits endlessly. Machiavelli distinguished between the prince who rules through love alone, constantly vulnerable to betrayal when affection wanes, and the prince who secures his position through a combination of respect and calculated fear, ensuring that even those who do not love him dare not move against him. This principle extends far beyond politics, into every realm of human interaction, into workplaces where boundaries determine whether you are valued or exploited, into relationships where the balance of power shapes whether you are cherished or taken for granted, into social circles where your willingness to enforce consequences determines whether your word carries weight or dissolves into meaningless noise. The transformation from being disrespected to commanding genuine power does not occur through aggressive displays or theatrical posturing, but through a fundamental shift in how you perceive yourself and project that perception into the world around you. Machiavelli taught that the effective prince must cultivate certain qualities, must learn to appear one way while being prepared to act another, must understand that survival and success require flexibility rather than rigid adherence to ideals that leave you vulnerable. He emphasized that those who achieve lasting power do so not by announcing their intentions loudly, but by acting decisively when action is required, not by making empty threats, but by ensuring that their few warnings carry the weight of inevitable consequence, not by seeking to be universally loved, which is impossible, but by ensuring they are strategically respected and, when necessary, appropriately feared. The knowledge contained in this exploration of Machiavellian principles offers something more valuable than techniques or tactics. It offers a lens through which to view human nature without illusion, to recognize the patterns that govern why people behave as they do, and to position yourself not as a passive victim of these dynamics, but as someone who understands them well enough to navigate them successfully. Once you internalize these lessons, once you see clearly how respect is established and power is maintained, you will find that the disrespect that once plagued you diminishes not because people have suddenly become better, but because you have become someone they instinctively recognize as possessing boundaries that cannot be violated without repercussion. This is not about becoming cruel or abandoning your values, but about surrounding those values with a framework of strength that allows them to flourish without being exploited, about learning to be, as Machiavelli advised, both the lion and the fox, fierce enough to frighten wolves and clever enough to recognize traps. The roots of disrespect lie not in the character of those who disrespect you, but in the permissions you have unknowingly granted through patterns of response that teach others how far they can push before encountering resistance. Machiavelli observed that in the courts of Renaissance Italy, ambassadors and courtiers constantly tested the resolve of princes, probing for weakness with small transgressions, carefully noting which boundaries were enforced and which existed only in words without consequences. Those rulers who failed to respond decisively to early violations found themselves facing increasingly bold challenges until their authority dissolved entirely, not through a single dramatic overthrow, but through 1,000 small erosions of respect that accumulated until nothing remained. The lesson here extends beyond statecraft into every relationship and interaction, revealing that disrespect is fundamentally a form of social mapping, a process by which others determine the limits of acceptable behavior through experimentation and observation. When someone first crosses a boundary with you, making a cutting remark, violating an agreement, or treating your time as worthless, they are conducting an experiment to determine whether you are someone who enforces consequences or someone who absorbs transgressions silently. Machiavelli understood that this moment, often seemingly trivial, carries enormous weight because your response establishes a precedent that will shape all future interactions with that individual and, by observation, with others who witness the exchange. If you respond with gentle explanation, with patient reasoning about why their behavior was inappropriate, you may feel you have taken the high road. But you have actually taught them that transgressing against you costs nothing more than listening to a speech they can largely ignore. The pattern repeats, escalates, becomes normalized until you find yourself in a position where the disrespect is so entrenched that correcting it requires dramatic action that seems disproportionate only because you failed to respond proportionately at the beginning. The psychology behind this dynamic reveals an uncomfortable truth about human nature that Machiavelli articulated without sentimentality. People are fundamentally self-interested and will expand their sphere of advantage until they encounter resistance. This is not an indictment of humanity's moral character, but an observation about survival instincts and resource optimization that operates largely beneath conscious awareness. In environments where resources are finite, whether those resources are time, attention, respect, or material goods, individuals naturally probe their environment to determine where they can extract maximum benefit for minimum cost. Those who provide resources without requiring reciprocity or who accept poor treatment without imposing penalties become designated as sources of easy extraction, not through malicious intent necessarily, but through the unconscious calculus that governs human interaction. Machiavelli noted that the most dangerous position for any leader is to be perceived as both weak and wealthy, both accommodating and possessing something others desire, because this combination invites predation from all directions. The prince who wishes to maintain his state must therefore cultivate a reputation that precedes him, a known history of swift and certain response to transgressions that makes potential violators pause and recalculate whether the gain from disrespecting him outweighs the cost. This reputation cannot be built through words alone, but must be demonstrated through consistent action, through a willingness to accept short-term conflict in exchange for long-term respect. The ruler who seeks to avoid all confrontation, who values harmony above boundaries, who hopes that patience and understanding will eventually transform the behavior of others, inevitably finds himself surrounded by those who interpret these qualities as opportunities rather than virtues. The transformation begins when you recognize that allowing disrespect is not kindness, but enabling, not patience, but passivity, not taking the high road, but surrendering the terrain of self-respect to those who have no compunction about claiming it. Machiavelli would argue that you have a responsibility, not just to yourself, but to the integrity of the social order, to enforce reasonable boundaries, because when you allow yourself to be disrespected, you create a model that others observe and potentially emulate, spreading the pattern of transgression through your social network. Moreover, by accepting disrespect, you subtly teach the transgressor that such behavior is acceptable, arguably doing them a disservice by allowing them to develop habits that will eventually bring them into conflict with someone less patient who will respond more harshly than you would have. The shift from being disrespected to commanding respect requires an internal transformation before any external change becomes possible. A fundamental reorientation of how you view yourself and your right to set standards for how others treat you. Machiavelli observed that those who command respect naturally carry themselves with a certain quality, not arrogance but self-assurance, not aggression but certainty, a projected confidence that they have the right to enforce their boundaries and the capacity to do so effectively. This quality cannot be faked convincingly over time, because it must rest on genuine willingness to accept the costs of enforcement, to endure short-term disapproval or conflict in service of long-term respect and autonomy. Until you make peace with the reality that commanding respect sometimes requires difficult conversations, withdrawn access, or severed relationships, you will continue to project uncertainty that others will unconsciously detect and exploit. The practical application of this principle begins with inventory, with honest assessment of the patterns in your life where disrespect manifests, the relationships where your boundaries are regularly violated, the contexts where your time is wasted, your contributions are minimized, or your needs are dismissed. Machiavelli would counsel that you examine these situations not with self-blame, but with strategic analysis, recognizing that the pattern exists not because you are inherently disrespectable, but because you have not yet established and enforced clear consequences for transgression. The question is not why others disrespect you, but what you have been teaching them through your patterns of response, and more importantly, what you can begin teaching them through altered patterns going forward. This is the foundation upon which power begins, the recognition that respect is not bestowed by others, but claimed through the strategic architecture of consequences, boundaries, and consistent enforcement. Throughout his observations of political and human nature, Machiavelli repeatedly encountered individuals who believed that consistent kindness, unconditional generosity, and unfailing patience would eventually win them the respect and loyalty they desired. He watched these well-intentioned people systematically undermined, exploited, and ultimately destroyed by those who recognized their patterns and used them strategically. The error these individuals made was not in valuing kindness, but in believing that kindness alone could navigate the complex dynamics of power, that goodness would be recognized and reciprocated rather than identified and exploited. Machiavelli's essential insight was not that kindness is weakness, but that unconditional kindness Kindness without boundaries or consequences creates vulnerabilities that make you dependent on the good intentions of others, a dependence that history has shown to be catastrophically unreliable. The person who practices unconditional niceness operates under several implicit assumptions that Machiavelli would have recognized as dangerous illusions. Chief among them, the belief that others will respond to your kindness with gratitude and reciprocity rather than entitlement and escalating demands. This assumption rests on a fundamentally optimistic view of human nature that, while admirable in its generosity of spirit, fails to account for the diversity of human character and motivation. Some people will indeed respond to kindness with kindness, recognizing and appreciating your generosity. However, others will interpret your kindness as evidence of exploitability, will test your boundaries to determine how much they can extract, and will continue taking until you demonstrate through action rather than words that limits exist. The unconditionally nice person, committed to their approach regardless of the response it generates, becomes predictable, and predictability without power is vulnerability. Machiavelli observed that predictability serves the powerful but endangers the weak, that the prince who can be relied upon to always respond in the same way loses the strategic advantage of uncertainty that keeps potential adversaries cautious. When everyone knows you will forgive any transgression, absorb any insult, accommodate any demand, they can factor your response into their calculations and act accordingly without fear of consequence. Your kindness becomes not a gift that inspires reciprocity, but a constant that can be safely ignored in others' strategic planning. This transforms you from a person worthy of respect into a resource to be managed and exploited, someone whose reactions are so reliably non-threatening that they need not be seriously considered when others pursue their interests at your expense. The psychological trap that ensnares the unconditionally nice person is the investment fallacy, the belief that if they just persist long enough in their kindness, the other person will eventually recognize their generosity and transform their behavior accordingly. Machiavelli would have recognized this as the gambler's fallacy applied to human relations, the mistaken belief that past investment predicts future return, when in fact each interaction is its own discrete event, influenced more by immediate incentives than historical patterns. The person who has disrespected you for months or years without consequence has learned through repeated experience that disrespecting you is cost-free and perhaps even rewarding. Your continued patience does not teach them to respect you. It reinforces their existing understanding that you are someone who can be transgressed against without repercussion. Changing this dynamic requires not more of the same, but a pattern interruption, a response so different from your established pattern that it forces recalculation. The cost of unconditional niceness extends beyond the immediate relationships where it manifests, shaping your broader reputation and influencing how others approach you, even in initial interactions. Machiavelli emphasized the importance of reputation, understanding that much of social power derives not from individual encounters, but from the expectations that precede them. If you are known as someone who never enforces boundaries, who always accommodates, who can be pushed without pushing back, this reputation attracts a particular type of person while repelling others, gradually surrounding you with individuals who value you precisely for your exploitability rather than your character. Meanwhile, those who might offer genuine friendship or partnership may avoid engagement, interpreting your lack of boundaries not as kindness, but as lack of self-respect, finding it difficult to respect someone who so evidently fails to respect themselves. The transformation away from unconditional niceness towards strategic kindness requires distinguishing between genuine generosity and fearful accommodation, between giving from abundance and giving from desperate hope of receiving approval or avoiding conflict. Machiavelli would counsel that true generosity comes from a position of strength, from chosen benevolence rather than compulsive people-pleasing, and that such generosity must be calibrated to the recipient's response rather than administered universally, regardless of whether it generates respect or contempt. Strategic kindness involves being generous to those who appreciate and reciprocate, while withdrawing that generosity from those who exploit it, using the distribution of your kindness as both reward and consequence, incentivizing the behavior you wish to encourage while imposing costs on behavior you wish to discourage. The practical implementation of this shift begins with the uncomfortable recognition that some relationships in your life exist not because of mutual respect or genuine affection, but because you have trained certain individuals to see you as a reliable source of unreciprocated benefit. Machiavelli observed that the prince who attempts to buy loyalty through constant generosity without demanding anything in return breeds not loyalty, but dependency mixed with contempt, creating subjects who rely on his largesse while resenting him for their dependence. The parallel in personal relationships manifests as friends who call only when they need something, colleagues who delegate their work to you, family members who take your support as given while offering nothing in return. Transforming these relationships requires the courage to alter your patterns, to introduce reciprocity as a condition for continued access, and to accept that some connections will end when they can no longer operate on the old terms, revealing they were never based on genuine regard, but on your usefulness as a resource. Power, in the Machiavellian framework, rests fundamentally on the capacity to impose consequences, to ensure that actions which transgress against your interests or violate your boundaries result in costs to the transgressor that exceed the benefits they gain from the transgression. This principle operates at every level of human organization, from international relations to intimate partnerships, from corporate hierarchies to casual friendships. Without the architecture of consequences, all boundaries are merely suggestions, all standards are negotiable, and all authority is illusory, maintained only as long as others choose voluntarily to respect it, which history demonstrates is a dangerously unreliable foundation. Machiavelli recognized that the prince who cannot or will not impose consequences when necessary has already lost his principality. He simply may not know it yet, because the final collapse often comes long after the initial failures of enforcement that made it inevitable. The architecture of consequences must be constructed with care, because its effectiveness depends not on severity alone, but on certainty, proportionality, and consistency. Machiavelli observed that harsh but unpredictable punishment creates fear without respect, breeding resentment that eventually manifests as rebellion or betrayal, while mild but certain consequences establish clear boundaries that rational actors learn to respect, because the cost-benefit calculation reliably favors compliance. The person who threatens dramatic consequences but rarely follows through teaches others to ignore their warnings, while the person who consistently imposes proportionate consequences for boundary violations trains their social environment to take their boundaries seriously. The key is not to rule through terror, but to ensure that transgressions reliably cost more than they benefit, shifting the incentive structure in favor of respectful behavior. Proportionality matters because disproportionate consequences undermine your moral authority and your reputation for fairness, potentially turning neutral observers against you and creating sympathy for those you punish. Machiavelli understood that the effective prince must not only wield power, but must be seen as wielding it justly, that the appearance of fairness increases the legitimacy of his rule and reduces resistance to his authority. When you impose consequences that match the severity of the transgression, you demonstrate not vindictiveness, but appropriate boundary enforcement, making it difficult for others to frame you as the aggressor rather than the defender of reasonable standards. A minor boundary violation requires a minor consequence, perhaps a calm verbal correction or a small reduction in access. A major violation requires a major consequence, perhaps severing the relationship entirely or imposing significant costs on the transgressor. This calibration demonstrates that you are not reactive or petty, but strategic and measured. Consistency transforms individual instances of consequence into a reliable system that shapes behavior over time, teaching those around you that your boundaries are not negotiable based on their emotional appeals, your temporary mood, or the inconvenience of enforcement. Machiavelli warned against the ruler who enforces rules only when convenient, who plays favorites in determining who receives punishment and who receives mercy, because such inconsistency destroys the predictive value that makes consequences effective behavior modifiers. When people cannot predict whether transgression will result in consequence, some will transgress anyway, gambling on leniency, while others will resent the arbitrary nature of enforcement, perceiving favoritism and injustice. Consistent enforcement, by contrast, creates an environment where everyone knows the rules, understands the consequences, and can make informed decisions about their behavior, which paradoxically reduces the need for enforcement over time as most rational actors adjust their behavior to avoid predictable costs. The psychology of consequences reveals that humans are remarkably adaptable creatures who adjust their behavior based on experienced reality rather than abstract principles or moral exhortations. Machiavelli's genius was recognizing that appealing to people's better nature works only with those who possess one and choose to exercise it, while creating environmental conditions that make virtue personally advantageous works with a much broader segment of humanity. When respecting you costs nothing and disrespecting you also costs nothing, many people will choose the path of convenience, testing boundaries and taking what they can. When respecting you offers continued access to your time, resources or companionship, while disrespecting you results in withdrawn access and tangible costs, the same people will calculate differently, choosing respect not necessarily from moral conviction, but from rational self-interest, which Machiavelli would argue is a more reliable foundation than hoping everyone will spontaneously choose virtue. The construction of effective consequences requires understanding what the transgressor actually values, because consequences divorced from the transgressor's priorities fail to modify behavior. Machiavelli emphasized knowing your enemies, understanding what they desire and what they fear, so that you can craft incentives and disincentives that actually influence their calculations. For someone who values your time and attention, withdrawn engagement serves as effective consequence. For someone who relies on your professional support, redirecting that support elsewhere imposes real costs. For someone who enjoys their status in your social circle, exclusion or reduced status creates incentive for behavior change. The art lies in identifying what the transgressor actually cares about rather than what you assume they should care about, then structuring consequences that affect those priorities directly. Implementation requires overcoming the internal resistance that prevents many people from imposing consequences even when intellectually they recognize the necessity. Machiavelli would identify this resistance as stemming from several sources: fear of conflict, desire to be liked, uncertainty about whether you have the right to impose consequences, or simple habit of accommodation that makes enforcement feel unnatural. The transformation requires reframing consequence not as punishment or revenge, but as teaching, as information you provide to others about the cost structure of different behaviors in relation to you. When someone crosses a boundary and you impose a consequence, you are not being mean. You are clarifying reality, helping them understand that the world they live in includes people who enforce boundaries. This reframe transforms consequence from something that feels harsh or unkind into something that is actually generous in its clarity, providing feedback that helps others calibrate their behavior for more successful social navigation. Among the most underestimated sources of power that Machiavelli identified is the capacity to withdraw, to remove yourself, your resources, your attention, or your participation from situations or relationships that fail to meet your standards. In a world that often emphasizes the importance of persistence, of fighting for every relationship, of never giving up on people or situations, Machiavelli's wisdom suggests that knowing when and how to withdraw is equally essential to maintaining power and commanding respect. The prince who fights every battle exhausts his resources and loses the strategic flexibility that allows him to focus his power where it matters most. Similarly, the individual who remains engaged in every relationship and committed to every situation regardless of how they are treated dissipates their power across contexts that drain rather than sustain them, becoming trapped in patterns of disrespect by their own unwillingness to leave. Strategic withdrawal operates on the principle that your presence, your effort, your resources and your energy are valuable commodities that should be invested where they generate returns, rather than squandered where they are taken for granted. Machiavelli observed that people value what they fear losing and take for granted what they assume will always be available. When you remain unconditionally present in someone's life, despite consistent disrespect, you teach them that you are a permanent fixture who will absorb whatever treatment they offer without consequence. Your value to them diminishes precisely because your availability is unconditional. Strategic withdrawal reverses this dynamic by introducing uncertainty, by demonstrating that access to you is contingent on how you are treated, forcing others to recalculate whether they can afford to lose your presence from their lives. The psychology of withdrawal reveals that absence often accomplishes what presence could not, creating space for others to recognize what they had, to experience the gap your departure creates, and potentially to realize they valued you more than their behavior suggested. Machiavelli understood that people often fail to appreciate what they have while they have it, requiring loss or the threat of loss to trigger recognition of value. When you withdraw from a relationship or situation that has consistently disrespected you, you provide the other party with an opportunity to experience life without you, to discover whether they can easily replace what you provided or whether your absence creates difficulties they had not anticipated. Some will discover they are fine without you, confirming that the relationship was already dead and your withdrawal merely formalized what already existed. Others will discover your value only in your absence and may seek to repair the relationship on better terms. The distinction between strategic withdrawal and emotional reactivity is crucial because the former demonstrates power, while the latter reveals powerlessness. Machiavelli would recognize the difference immediately. Strategic withdrawal is planned, communicated clearly if at all, and executed calmly with firm boundaries around what would need to change for re-engagement to occur. Emotional reactivity manifests as dramatic exits, declarations that you are done, followed by returns when emotions settle, teaching others that your boundaries are temporary and your withdrawals are performances rather than genuine consequences. Strategic withdrawal requires internal certainty that you are willing to make the departure permanent if conditions do not change, that you are not bluffing or hoping the other party will chase you, but genuinely removing yourself from a situation that does not serve you, indifferent to whether they respond by changing or by allowing your departure to become permanent. The challenge of strategic withdrawal lies in overcoming the deeply ingrained belief that leaving is failure, that giving up on people reflects poorly on your character, that loyalty demands you remain engaged even when engagement becomes self-destructive. Machiavelli would reframe this entirely, arguing that loyalty to people who disrespect you is disloyalty to yourself, that remaining in situations that diminish you is not perseverance but self-abandonment, that walking away from what does not serve you is not failure but wisdom. The prince who clings to territories that cost more to maintain than they generate in revenue bankrupts his state. The individual who clings to relationships that cost more in dignity and peace than they generate in genuine connection bankrupts their emotional resources and teaches others that their respect is optional. Implementation of strategic withdrawal requires clear communication of boundaries before withdrawal becomes necessary, giving others the opportunity to adjust their behavior before you remove yourself from the equation. Machiavelli emphasized that effective princes provide clear signals of their intentions, allowing subjects to comply before punishment becomes necessary, because ruling through constant surprise generates instability and resentment. When you communicate clearly that certain behaviors are unacceptable and will result in withdrawn engagement if they continue, you give the other party the information they need to choose their path. If they continue the behavior despite clear warning, your withdrawal becomes the logical consequence they were told to expect, framed not as emotional reaction, but as you following through on clearly stated conditions. The power that emerges from mastering strategic withdrawal is the power of self-possession, the capacity to say no to situations that do not serve you, to walk away from relationships that drain rather than sustain you, to remove yourself from environments that demand you diminish yourself to participate. Machiavelli observed that true power comes not from controlling others, but from controlling yourself, from having the discipline to refuse bad deals, the courage to endure loneliness rather than accept disrespectful company, the wisdom to recognize that an empty life can be filled with better connections, while a life cluttered with toxic relationships leaves no room for healthy ones. When others recognize that you possess this power, that you are genuinely willing to walk away rather than accept poor treatment, their behavior toward you shifts because they understand at a visceral level that access to you is a privilege that can be revoked, not a right they can exploit indefinitely. The ultimate realization that comes from practicing strategic withdrawal is that many relationships you thought you could not live without turn out to be surprisingly easy to release once you overcome the initial discomfort of separation. Machiavelli would understand this as confirmation that the relationship was costing you more than it was providing, that your attachment was based on habit or fear rather than genuine value. Some withdrawals become permanent, revealing that the relationship had reached its natural end and your departure simply acknowledged reality. Other withdrawals create the conditions for renewed engagement on healthier terms, with both parties having learned from the separation that mutual respect is not optional but foundational. Both outcomes represent success because both result in you living with greater alignment between your standards and your actual experience, commanding respect either in renewed relationships or in the absence of relationships that refuse to offer it. Machiavelli devoted considerable attention to the performance of power, recognizing that the appearance of strength often matters as much as its reality, that how others perceive your capacity and willingness to enforce your will shapes their behavior toward you as much as your actual capacity does. The effective prince understands that power is partly theatrical, that strategic displays of capability serve to deter challenges that would otherwise materialize, preventing conflicts through the projection of strength that makes potential adversaries calculate that challenging you costs more than accommodating you. This principle extends far beyond politics into every arena of human interaction, where your personal presentation, your reaction patterns, and your demonstrated willingness to enforce boundaries create a reputation that either invites respect or encourages exploitation. The performance of power begins with the careful management of your reactions to provocation, to disrespect, to attempts to diminish or manipulate you. Machiavelli observed that those who react emotionally to provocation hand power to their provocateurs, demonstrating that they can be manipulated through their emotions, their buttons pushed reliably to generate predictable responses. The person who becomes visibly angry, defensive, or hurt when disrespected reveals vulnerability that invites further testing, shows that the provocation landed and therefore encourages repetition. By contrast, the person who responds to disrespect with calm clarity, neither ignoring it nor reacting emotionally to it, projects an image of self-possession that suggests depth of character and reserves of power that wise people will not wish to test further. Your emotional control becomes evidence of your power, signaling that you operate from a position of strength rather than insecurity. The language you use to address disrespect carries enormous weight in shaping how others perceive your power and how they calibrate future behavior toward you. Machiavelli would distinguish sharply between weak language that requests better treatment and powerful language that establishes expectations and consequences. Weak language sounds like pleading, "I wish you would not speak to me that way," or "It hurts my feelings when you treat me like this." This language centers your emotional vulnerability and implicitly asks the other person to choose to behave better out of consideration for your feelings, which may or may not motivate them, depending on whether they care about your feelings. Powerful language sounds like statement of fact. "I do not accept that tone," or "We will not continue this conversation while you are speaking disrespectfully." This language centers your standards and your boundaries, making clear that the issue is not whether they care about your feelings, but whether they wish to maintain access to continued interaction with you. The strategic use of silence represents one of Machiavelli's most subtle insights about power. The recognition that saying nothing often communicates more than elaborate explanation, that allowing uncomfortable pauses to extend forces others to fill the void, and often reveal more than they intended. When someone disrespects you and you respond with silence rather than immediate defensive explanation, you create uncertainty about how you have received their transgression, whether you are considering your response, whether you are angry but controlled, or whether you have simply noted their behavior for future reference. This uncertainty generates anxiety in the transgressor that often accomplishes more than direct confrontation, causing them to recalculate, perhaps even to apologize or explain without you having to demand it. Silence wielded strategically demonstrates that you are not desperate for their approval, not anxious to smooth things over, but comfortable with tension and willing to let them sit with the consequences of their behavior. The cultivation of options serves as perhaps the most fundamental aspect of power performance, because power ultimately derives from alternatives, from the capacity to walk away because other opportunities exist, other relationships beckon, other paths remain open. Machiavelli understood that the prince who depends entirely on a single alliance, a single source of revenue, or a single base of support becomes vulnerable to that dependency, subject to exploitation by those who recognize they cannot be replaced. The individual who invests all their social energy in a single relationship, all their professional identity in a single job, or all their self-worth in a single role becomes similarly vulnerable, unable to enforce boundaries or walk away from disrespect because they lack alternatives. Cultivating options requires deliberately maintaining diverse relationships, developing multiple skills, nurturing various interests, and ensuring that no single person or situation holds monopoly over your happiness or success. The demonstration of competence across multiple domains reinforces the performance of power by establishing that you are a multifaceted individual with resources, capabilities, and alternatives that make you valuable rather than dependent. Machiavelli observed that respect flows naturally toward those who demonstrate excellence, who show themselves capable of thriving independently, who project an image of someone who chooses their relationships and situations rather than clinging to them out of necessity. When others perceive you as competent and resourced, they intuitively recognize that you have options, that disrespecting you risks losing access to someone who could easily direct their energy elsewhere. This perception shifts the power dynamic, transforming you from supplicant, hoping for acceptance, into selector choosing where to invest your limited time and energy. The careful management of information about yourself, your plans, your vulnerabilities, and your resources forms another crucial element of power performance that Machiavelli emphasized repeatedly. He cautioned against excessive transparency that provides others with detailed knowledge of your weaknesses, your fears, or your strategies, recognizing that information asymmetry favors those who know more while revealing less. When you share every detail of your inner life, every insecurity and doubt, you provide others with a roadmap for manipulating you, with knowledge of exactly which buttons to push to generate your desired responses. Strategic opacity, revealing enough to build connection but maintaining privacy around your core vulnerabilities and plans, preserves power by keeping others uncertain about your full capabilities and limits, unable to predict exactly how you will respond or what resources you can bring to bear if challenged. The transformation that occurs when you master the performance of power is subtle but profound. A shift in how others instinctively position themselves in relation to you, moving from testing your boundaries to respecting them preemptively, from assuming they can transgress to calculating whether transgression is worth the potential cost. Machiavelli recognized that much of power operates unconsciously, that people respond to projected strength or weakness below the level of deliberate thought, adjusting their behavior based on instinctive assessment of who can be pushed and who pushes back. When your performance consistently demonstrates calm strength, clear boundaries, multiple options, and willingness to enforce consequences, you train your social environment to approach you with baseline respect, not because they have consciously decided to respect you, but because your presentation triggers instinctive caution that makes disrespect feel risky rather than safe. The implementation of Machiavellian principles inevitably transforms your existing relationships, creating a period of turbulence as those accustomed to the old dynamic resist adjustment to the new one, testing whether your changes represent genuine transformation or temporary performance that will eventually revert to familiar patterns. Machiavelli would have recognized this testing phase as both inevitable and revealing, a clarifying process that separates relationships capable of evolution from those fundamentally dependent on your previous passivity or accommodation. During this period, some people in your life will rise to meet your new standards, recognizing that the relationship must be recalibrated and choosing to adjust their behavior accordingly. Others will resist, escalate their testing, attempt to guilt or manipulate you back into previous patterns, ultimately revealing that they preferred the version of you who accepted disrespect because it served their interests. The resistance you encounter when you begin enforcing boundaries after a long history of failing to do so often manifests as accusations that you have changed, become difficult, or turned into someone unrecognizable. Machiavelli would recognize this resistance as predictable defense of the status quo by those who benefited from it, a strategic attempt to frame your growth as regression, your healthy boundary setting as unreasonable rigidity. The person who previously exploited your lack of boundaries has no incentive to celebrate your development of them, will naturally resist transformation that eliminates their advantage and will often attempt to leverage your existing relationship history and emotional connections to pressure you into reverting to previous patterns. Understanding this resistance as strategic rather than honest confusion about your behavior helps you weather it without wavering, recognizing that those who truly care about you will support your growth even when it requires them to adjust, while those who resist your boundaries were never invested in your well-being but in their access to your resources. The recalibration of relationships from unbalanced to balanced dynamics requires patience because people need time to unlearn old patterns and establish new ones, to realize that you truly mean what you say about your boundaries, that consequences you establish are real rather than empty threats. Machiavelli understood that behavioral change occurs gradually through repeated experience of new consequences, not through single dramatic moments of realization. The friend who has always called only when they need something will not immediately transform into a reciprocal relationship partner after one conversation about balance. They will likely test the new boundary, call again with a problem while offering nothing in return, providing you the opportunity to demonstrate through action rather than words that the old pattern no longer functions. Multiple repetitions of this cycle, with you consistently enforcing reciprocity as condition for continued investment, gradually teaches them that the relationship has fundamentally changed, that continued access requires adjusted behavior. The phenomenon Machiavelli might have called the sorting reveals itself during this transformation period, as relationships naturally separate into categories based on their capacity and willingness to meet your new standards. Some relationships deepen and strengthen, with both parties recognizing that mutual respect creates more satisfying connection than the previous dynamic where one person gave and the other took. These relationships survive the transformation and emerge healthier, proving their fundamental soundness and the genuine regard both parties hold for each other. Other relationships fade or end entirely, unable to function under conditions of mutual respect because they were never based on such respect, but on your usefulness as resource. These relationships appear to be casualties of your transformation, but Machiavelli would recognize them as dead relationships that were already draining you, their ending not a loss but a liberation of energy previously trapped in unsustaining patterns. The grief that often accompanies the loss of relationships during this transformation period is real and should be acknowledged. But Machiavelli would counsel against allowing that grief to derail your progress or convince you to revert to previous patterns. The mourning you feel is not primarily for the relationships themselves, but for the illusions you held about them, for the hope that they could become what they never were, for the fantasy that if you just gave enough or endured enough, the other person would eventually reciprocate. Releasing these relationships creates space in your life for connections built on different foundations, for friendships and partnerships where respect is mutual from the start, rather than something you must fight to establish after years of accepting less. The temporary loneliness of this transition phase is the price of admission to a life where your relationships sustain rather than drain you. The establishment of new relationships from a position of clearly defined and consistently enforced boundaries represents one of the greatest gifts you can give yourself in the aftermath of this transformation. Machiavelli would recognize that starting fresh with people who have only known the empowered version of you, who have never experienced your previous patterns of over-accommodation, creates relationships free from the historical baggage that complicates transformation of existing connections. New people in your life learn from the beginning that you are someone who enforces boundaries, who expects reciprocity, who offers generosity but not exploitation, establishing dynamics of mutual respect from the first interaction rather than having to rebuild from foundations of previous imbalance. These relationships often develop more smoothly and satisfyingly precisely because they begin at the level of health that older relationships are struggling to reach. The ultimate transformation that occurs in your relational landscape when you fully integrate Machiavellian principles is a shift from quantity to quality, from collecting many relationships that provide intermittent validation to cultivating fewer relationships that offer genuine connection, from being surrounded by people who enjoy what you provide them to being surrounded by people who appreciate who you are. Machiavelli observed that the prince who seeks to be loved by everyone is constantly vulnerable to betrayal, while the prince who cultivates strategic alliances with those who share his interests and respect his power creates a more stable foundation for his rule. Similarly, the individual who releases the fantasy of universal likability, who accepts that enforcing boundaries will make some people uncomfortable or cause them to leave, who prioritizes self-respect over being endlessly accommodating, discovers that the relationships which remain and the new relationships which form are of fundamentally higher quality, built on mutual regard rather than one-sided extraction, sustained by choice rather than habit or desperation. The common misreading of Machiavelli portrays him as advocating pure ruthlessness divorced from ethics, but careful attention to his work reveals a more nuanced position. That effectiveness requires understanding power dynamics and being willing to use power when necessary, while ideally governing with virtue when circumstances allow. The synthesis of these elements, the capacity to be both strong and good, both capable of enforcement and preferring cooperation, represents the highest expression of Machiavellian wisdom applied to personal life. The person who masters this integration becomes someone who commands respect, not through fear alone, but through a combination of demonstrated capability and genuine character. Someone others recognize as possessing both the power to impose consequences and the judgment to use that power proportionately and justly. The balance between power and virtue requires internal clarity about your values and commitment to those values even while navigating the sometimes harsh realities of human interaction. Machiavelli distinguished between being good and appearing good, noting that the prince who is inflexibly good in a world where others are not constrains himself while his enemies feel no such constraint, placing himself at systematic disadvantage. However, this observation is not advocacy for abandoning virtue, but recognition that virtue without power cannot sustain itself, that noble values must be protected by strength or they will be exploited by those less principled. The integration involves maintaining your values as your guiding compass while developing the strategic capacity to enforce boundaries that protect your ability to live according to those values, refusing to allow others to exploit your principles as leverage against you. The cultivation of wisdom about when to employ which approach, when to lead with generosity and when to lead with strength, when to offer second chances and when to impose definitive consequences, represents the art of Machiavellian practice applied to modern life. Machiavelli himself emphasized that the effective ruler must be like the fox and the lion, clever enough to see traps and strong enough to frighten predators, knowing which quality the situation demands. In personal application, this translates to developing sophisticated judgment about the people and situations you encounter, distinguishing those who deserve your generosity from those who will exploit it, recognizing when someone's disrespect stems from ignorance that can be corrected versus character defects that cannot, understanding when relationship investment is likely to pay returns versus when it represents throwing good energy after bad. The transformation from either powerless virtue or virtuous power to integrated wisdom requires experience, requires making mistakes in both directions, being sometimes too harsh and sometimes too accommodating, gradually calibrating your responses through feedback from results rather than abstract principles. Machiavelli was fundamentally a pragmatist who believed that strategies should be judged by their outcomes, that the proof of effective approach lies in whether it achieves the desired ends while maintaining the conditions necessary for sustainable success. Applied personally, this means evaluating your boundary enforcement not by whether it feels comfortable or matches some idealized image of who you think you should be, but by whether it generates the respect and relationship quality you seek, adjusting your approach based on what actually works rather than what you wish would work. The recognition that you can be simultaneously kind and powerful, generous and boundaried, compassionate and unwilling to be exploited, liberates you from the false dichotomy that positions strength and goodness as opposites. Machiavelli would argue that true kindness requires strength to protect it from exploitation, that sustainable generosity depends on boundaries that prevent it from being taken for granted, that lasting compassion must be selective rather than universal, or it exhausts itself and becomes impossible to sustain. The integrated person gives generously to those who appreciate and reciprocate, enforces boundaries with those who transgress, and possesses the wisdom to distinguish between these categories. This is not compromise of values, but mature application of them. Recognition that your capacity to live according to your principles depends on protecting yourself from those who would exploit those principles against you. The practical expression of integrated power and virtue manifests as leadership in your personal sphere, as becoming someone others look to, as example of how to live with both strength and integrity. Machiavelli understood that true leadership inspires emulation rather than merely commanding obedience, that the most powerful princes are those whose subjects wish to be like them rather than those whose subjects merely fear punishment. When you successfully integrate power and virtue in your personal life, others notice, recognize the quality of your relationships and the respect you command, and often seek guidance about how to develop similar capacity in their own lives. Your example becomes teaching without requiring you to lecture or convince, demonstrating through lived experience that it is possible to maintain strong values while refusing to be victimized by those with weaker ones. The ultimate gift of this integration is internal peace that comes from alignment between your values and your boundaries, from knowing that you neither exploit others nor allow yourself to be exploited, that you give generously when generosity is appropriate and withdraw firmly when boundaries are crossed. Machiavelli sought to describe political arrangements that could be stable and sustainable, recognizing that systems built on either pure idealism or pure power were inherently unstable and prone to collapse. The parallel in personal life is that sustainable well-being requires this same balance, requires being idealistic enough to maintain hope and standards while being realistic enough to protect yourself from exploitation, requires being strong enough to enforce boundaries while being kind enough to be worth knowing. The person who achieves this balance discovers that respect and genuine connection are not mutually exclusive, but mutually reinforcing. That commanding respect creates conditions under which authentic relationships flourish because they are chosen rather than endured, based on mutual regard rather than one-sided accommodation. The journey from being chronically disrespected to commanding genuine power represents not a transformation into someone unrecognizable, but an awakening into fuller expression of who you have always been beneath layers of social conditioning that taught you to shrink, to accommodate, to prioritize others' comfort over your own dignity. Machiavelli would recognize this awakening as the moment when you stop operating according to how you wish the world were, and start navigating effectively through the world as it actually is, populated by diverse humans with varying levels of integrity, consciousness, and regard for others. This shift from naive idealism to mature realism does not require abandoning your values, but protecting them with boundaries strong enough to ensure they can flourish, surrounding your essential goodness with strategic capacity to defend it from exploitation. The power you develop through this process serves not to dominate others, but to liberate yourself from their disrespect, creating space to choose relationships and situations that honor rather than diminish you. The principles explored throughout this journey, from understanding the foundations of disrespect to constructing consequences, from mastering strategic withdrawal to performing power effectively, from transforming relationships to integrating strength with virtue, form a comprehensive framework for reclaiming your dignity and establishing yourself as someone who commands respect naturally rather than begging for it unsuccessfully. Each principle builds upon the others, creating a systematic approach to changing not only how others treat you, but how you perceive yourself, shifting your internal narrative from victim of others' behavior to architect of your relational environment. The implementation of these principles requires courage because it demands you risk the loss of relationships built on your previous accommodation, accept temporary discomfort in service of long-term respect, and release the fantasy that universal likability is either achievable or desirable. However, those who find this courage discover that the temporary turbulence of transformation gives way to a life of fundamentally higher quality, where relationships sustain rather than drain, where your standards shape your experience rather than being perpetually violated. The wisdom Machiavelli offers across the centuries speaks to something timeless about human nature and power dynamics, something that has not changed despite all our technological advancement and social progress, because it is rooted in fundamental aspects of how humans assess and respond to strength and weakness, how we determine whom to respect and whom to exploit. His observations remain relevant precisely because they describe patterns that emerge from human nature itself rather than from particular cultural or historical circumstances, patterns that manifest in modern workplaces and friendships just as they manifested in Renaissance courts and battlefields. The person who studies and applies these principles gains access to tested wisdom about navigating human interaction effectively, learning from centuries of observation rather than only from personal trial and error, accelerating their development of the strategic capacity that transforms them from someone who experiences life as something that happens to them into someone who shapes their experience through conscious choice and consistent enforcement of boundaries. The transformation this knowledge enables is not instant or automatic, but unfolds gradually as you practice new patterns, make mistakes, recalibrate, and slowly develop the muscle memory of boundary enforcement until it becomes natural rather than effortful. Machiavelli understood that lasting change requires repetition and time, that attempting to transform overnight from accommodating to boundaried generates inconsistency that undermines your credibility. The sustainable approach involves starting small, perhaps enforcing boundaries with less important relationships or in lower stakes situations, building confidence and competence before attempting to transform your most significant or challenging relational dynamics. Each successful boundary enforcement strengthens your capacity for the next. Each consequence you follow through on reinforces your internal certainty that you can and will protect your dignity, gradually building momentum until the new patterns become your default rather than conscious effort. The life that awaits on the other side of this transformation bears little resemblance to the life you leave behind. Not because your external circumstances necessarily change dramatically, but because your internal experience of those circumstances shifts fundamentally when you command respect rather than perpetually tolerating its absence. The weight of accumulated disrespect, the constant low-grade stress of having your boundaries violated, the exhaustion of relationships that take more than they give, the resentment that builds from repeated accommodation of unacceptable behavior, all of this dissolves when you establish and enforce standards for how you will be treated. In its place emerges something lighter but stronger, a sense of self-possession that comes from knowing you are no longer at the mercy of others' whims, that you have claimed authority over your own life and relationships, that respect is not something you hope others will grant, but something you ensure through the strategic architecture of consequences and boundaries. This is the power that begins when disrespect stops, the power of living according to your own standards, rather than adjusting endlessly to accommodate those who refuse to meet them. If this exploration of Machiavellian wisdom has resonated with you, has sparked recognition of patterns in your own life, or illuminated paths forward you had not previously considered, then honor that recognition by taking action rather than merely absorbing information passively. The knowledge means nothing without application. The principles remain theoretical unless you implement them in your actual relationships and situations. Testing and refining your approach through lived experience. Share this content with others who might benefit from these insights, not to lecture them about their need to change, but to offer resources that could support their own journey toward commanding respect and developing power. Leave a comment describing which principle landed most powerfully for you, or sharing your own experiences with the transformation from accommodating to boundaried, creating community around these insights and learning from each other's applications. Subscribe to continue this exploration of how to navigate human interaction more effectively, to delve deeper into principles that create sustainable well-being and authentic power, to build together a framework for living with both strength and integrity in a world that often rewards neither.